My father turned 70 that Saturday. Our backyard smelled like barbecue and celebration. Then red and blue lights hit the fence line. The dispatcher had said, possible gang activity, for a birthday party. My son froze. 6 months later, the whole street learned who actually lied. A fire truck rolled up first. Sirens screaming down our quiet road. What the chief carried out of that truck changed everything. My name is Marcus Coleman, 38 years old, a high school shop teacher who married his college sweetheart, Denise, and bought a modest 4-bedroom house on Willowbrook Court 11 years ago because the schools were good and the yard was big enough for a swing set. We raised our 2 kids there, Zoe and little Andre, and every summer my father, James, a retired fire captain with 30 years on the job, drove up from Charlotte to spend 2 weeks with us, ending always with a backyard cookout on his birthday. Willowbrook Court belonged to the Ashford Meadows Homeowners Association, a tidy grid of beige houses and clipped hedges where every mailbox matched and every lawn was mowed on Saturdays. And for years I mistook that sameness for peace. The HOA president was Diane Whitfield, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had lived on the court since the neighborhood was built, and who treated the community newsletter like scripture and the bylaws like a weapon she alone was permitted to carry. Diane's husband, Roger, had actually founded the HOA decades earlier with a simple goal: keep property values steady and neighbors friendly. But Roger passed 3 years before we moved in, and somewhere along the way Diane rewrote his intentions into something colder. She measured grass height with a ruler. She photographed cars parked an inch over a curb line. She once sent a certified letter to a family for leaving a garden hose visible from the street, citing unsightly clutter in violation of Section 4, Paragraph 2. At first I laughed it off with Denise over coffee, calling Diane the Sheriff of Beige, because her complaints seemed almost comically petty, the kind of thing you shrug about at book club and forget by Tuesday. But Denise, sharper than me about people, noticed something I hadn't. Diane's fines and warnings landed heaviest on the newer families, the renters, and especially on us and the Okafors 2 doors down, the only black families on the court. I told myself it was paranoia. I wanted to believe a community built on shared driveways and 4th of July potlucks couldn't be quietly sorting its members by something as old and ugly as race. Still, small things piled up. Our recycling bin was improperly positioned 3 separate times in 1 month. The Okafors were fined for a basketball hoop identical to the one at the Hendersons' house, which somehow never drew a single complaint. Diane always had a reason, delivered in the same calm, almost maternal tone, as if she were doing us a kindness by pointing out our failures before someone less understanding reported us to the board. I started keeping a folder. Not out of suspicion exactly, more habit. The same instinct that made me photograph a busted brake light before an insurance claim. Denise called it my receipts folder. I didn't expect I'd ever need it. My father, when he visited, noticed Diane too. "That woman watches you the way Dispatch watches a radio," he said once. Half joking, half serious. The kind of thing 30 years of firehouse instinct teaches a man to say. He'd retired as a captain in a mostly white department in the 90s. Had seen plenty of Dianes in his time, polite on the surface, immovable underneath, and he carried a quiet, practiced patience that I hadn't fully earned yet myself. That June, planning his 70th birthday, I wanted to do it right. A real backyard cookout, ribs on the smoker since morning, string lights, Andre's friends from the block, the Okafor family, maybe 20 people total. Nothing wild. Done by 9. I submitted the standard HOA event notice 2 weeks early, as required for any gathering over 15 guests, listing the date, time, and guest count, because I had learned by then that with Diane, paperwork was armor. She approved it in writing, adding only one line, "Please keep noise to a reasonable level after 8 p.m. per community guidelines," which felt fair enough, and I filed the approval email in my folder without a second thought. The morning of the party, Diane appeared at my fence at 10 a.m., ostensibly to welcome guests, but really to survey the smoker, the folding tables, and the cooler of drinks with the flat, assessing look of an appraiser. "Quite a production," she said, smiling in that way that never reached her eyes. I thanked her for approving the event and offered her a plate later. She said she'd see, and left without another word. By early afternoon our yard was full, laughter, gospel and R&B rotating on a speaker, kids cannonballing into the inflatable pool, my father holding court by the smoker telling firehouse stories that had my brother-in-law nearly falling off his chair. Diane's minivan pulled out around 2. I noticed only because Denise pointed it out, joking that the sheriff was probably going to get more film for her camera roll. A joke that would feel far less funny in a few hours. At 4:15, a squad car turned onto Willowbrook Court, slow and deliberate, and parked directly in front of my house. I remember the exact silence that fell over our yard, the way 20 conversations died at once. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, and asked to speak with the homeowner regarding a disturbance and a report of possible weapons on the property, and my stomach dropped through the concrete patio. My father set down his tongs. Denise grabbed Andre's shoulder without thinking. I walked to the fence with my hands visible, the way I'd taught my own son to do since he was 12, and answered every question as calmly as I could manage. The officers explained a resident had called reporting a large, aggressive gathering, loud music, and possible gang-related activity, with individuals possibly carrying firearms, at this address, this afternoon, this birthday party for a retired fire captain. I asked, as evenly as my shaking voice allowed, who had called. The younger officer hesitated, then said the caller's name wasn't something they typically shared, though the dispatch log would list the address the call came from. My father, calm in the way only 3 decades of emergencies can make a man, stepped forward and identified himself, badge number and department memorized after all these years, and offered to show his retirement ID from his wallet. 028. One officer recognized the rank insignia on my father's old department cap, sitting on the picnic table, and something in his posture eased slightly, though he still walked the yard, checking coolers, checking the smoker, checking us. They found nothing. Of course, no weapon. No disturbance beyond a speaker set to a volume any of the 15 other yards on that street had matched 100 times without complaint, and they left within 20 minutes, apologizing for the interruption. But 20 minutes is a long time to stand in your own backyard with your hands raised in front of your children, your father, and your neighbors, while your birthday cake melts untouched on the table. The party didn't end so much as deflate. Guests left early, murmuring comfort that couldn't quite land. My father sat back down at the smoker, quiet now, staring at coals he'd been so proud of an hour earlier. "I've had worse," he told me later. Which was true and also the saddest thing he could have said. Because no 70-year-old man should have a scale for measuring which humiliations are worse than others. That night, checking the community forum out of habit, I found a post from Diane Whitfield timestamped 2:47 p.m. Reminder to all residents. Please report any gatherings that seem unsafe. Better safe than sorry. Folded hands. No names. No addresses. Nothing that could be pinned directly to her. But the timestamp matched almost exactly when her minivan had left the court. And I felt something cold and certain settle into my chest. I didn't have proof yet. A timestamp, and a promise to myself, made quietly at my kitchen table at midnight, that I would find out exactly what had happened to my father's birthday. The next morning I filed a public records request for the 911 call log. Something Denise's cousin, a paralegal, told me any resident could legally do, since dispatch calls to a public address are generally accessible records. It would take 2 weeks to process. The clerk said. 2 weeks felt unbearable. So in the meantime, I did the only other thing I could think of. I started talking to neighbors, carefully, one at a time. The Okafors weren't surprised. Amara Okafor told me Diane had once told her, almost sweetly, that their son's friends coming and going made some people uneasy. A sentence that meant everything and could be denied as meaning nothing. Old Mr. 3 houses down. A widower who'd lived there since the subdivision broke ground, told me Diane had complained about outsiders at our party specifically, using a phrase he found strange enough to remember. You know how those gatherings get. I asked him directly if he'd testify to hearing that. He looked uncomfortable, said he didn't want trouble with Diane. And I understood. Trouble with Diane apparently meant something real on this street. Something I was only now learning the shape of. Denise found something too, an old thread in the neighborhood Facebook group from 4 years earlier, before we'd moved in, where Diane had objected to a Juneteenth cookout hosted by a family that no longer lived on the court. Her comment, still visible, read, "Not everything needs to be a whole event. Some of us just want peace and quiet in our neighborhood." The post had 14 likes. I recognized 3 of those names from our own street. I brought this to my father, laid it all out on the kitchen table like evidence at a briefing, and he listened the way he used to listen to rookies describing a scene, patient and showy, absorbing everything before reacting. "Folders a start," he said finally. "But folders don't move people. People move people. Street can see it. Not just where you and Denise can see it." I wasn't ready for that yet. I told myself I wanted the 911 records first. Wanted something undeniable before I made this loud. Because I'd learned the hard way that black anger, however justified, gets read as the actual crime. So I waited, and while I waited, Diane escalated in her own quiet way, mailing me a violation notice 3 days after the party. Excessive noise and unauthorized commercial-style cooking equipment, smoker, creating fire hazard concerns. The smoker had been on our patio, on a concrete pad, 12 feet from the house, exactly per the manufacturer's clearance guidelines and, notably, identical to the smoker the Hendersons ran every single weekend without so much as a raised eyebrow. I photographed both smokers, side by side in my head if not literally, added the notice to my folder, and paid the small fine rather than fight it yet. because I still believed patience would outlast pettiness. Andre, my son, 12 years old and sharper than he should have had to be at that age, asked me one night why the police came to Grandpa's birthday. I gave him the honest, unsatisfying answer, because someone was afraid of us for no real reason. He sat with that a long moment, then asked if it would happen again. I told him I didn't know, which was the truth, and watching that truth land on his face was worse than anything Diane had done to me directly. 2 weeks later, the 911 records arrived. The call had come from a landline registered to the Whitfield residence, placed at 2:52 p.m., 5 minutes after Diane's public forum post, reporting possible gang activity and firearms at our address. The transcript included the caller describing loud, aggressive music, many unfamiliar young men, and what looked like someone concealing a weapon under a grill cover. A detail so specific and so false it could only have been invented deliberately. I sat with that transcript for a long time before showing Denise. There's a particular kind of anger that arrives quiet instead of loud, that settles into your hands instead of your voice, and that's the anger I felt reading it. "There it is," Denise said softly, reading over my shoulder. Now what? I didn't have an answer yet. Only the growing certainty that whatever I did next needed to be careful, documented, and impossible to spin as overreaction. I called my cousin Terrence, a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, and read him the transcript. He was quiet for a moment, then said the phrase I'd remember for months. "That's not a mistake. That's a pattern with one incident visible." He advised me not to confront Diane directly yet, not to post the transcript publicly without legal review, and instead to keep building the file: HOA records, forum posts, fine histories, anything showing disparity in enforcement across the court. So the folder grew, of HOA violation records under the association's own transparency bylaws. A request Diane, as president, was legally obligated to fulfill within 30 days, whether or not she wanted to. She stalled. Records were being digitized, then that the request needed board approval, then that certain records were confidential personnel matters, an excuse that made no sense for a homeowners association with no employees. Every stall was itself a small twist of the knife, and every stall, I now understood, was also evidence, the behavior of someone protecting something rather than someone with nothing to hide. Meanwhile, life had to continue. My father flew home to Charlotte, hugging me tight at the airport gate and telling me, in his low firehouse voice, "Don't let this turn you bitter, son. Let it turn you thorough." I turned thorough, cross-referencing every publicly visible HOA fine over 3 years with the race of the household, using nothing but names, addresses, and public forum comments. A project that took me 6 exhausting weekends. The pattern, once graphed, was almost too clean to be believable. Households of color represented 11% of the court but had received 64% of all documented fines, warnings, and friendly reminders issued by the association. Terrence reviewed the spreadsheet and told me it wouldn't hold up alone in any legal sense. Correlation wasn't proof of intent, but paired with the 911 transcript and the forum posts, it painted a picture no reasonable person could dismiss as coincidence. Around this time, something unexpected happened. Mr. Petrosky, the widower who'd been too afraid to talk before, knocked on my door one evening holding a folder of his own. thick with printed emails Diane had sent him privately over the years. He explained he'd started keeping copies after Diane once threatened to report his adult son, who has a disability and sometimes paces the driveway talking to himself, as a public safety concern requiring board review. Something in Petrosky had apparently reached its limit that day, though he'd stayed quiet out of fear. And now, seeing what had happened to my father, he decided quiet wasn't protecting anyone, least of all himself. His emails included one particularly damning line from Diane. "We have to be careful about who we let feel too comfortable here, or the whole character of the neighborhood changes." I read it twice to make sure I hadn't imagined it. Terrence called that line a gift, the kind of unguarded sentence people write when they've never once imagined being held accountable for it, certain their authority made them untouchable. Emboldened, I reached out quietly to 3 more households, the Ramirez family, the Nguyen's, and a young interracial couple, the Barlows, and each had a version of the same story. Disproportionate scrutiny wrapped in polite, deniable language. None of them had kept records the way Petrosky or I had, which meant our 2 folders were about to become the backbone of something much larger. A case built not on feelings but on dates, names, and documents. I still hadn't told Diane I knew any of this. She continued operating exactly as before, sending a new violation notice for our mailbox post being a non-standard shade of black. A distinction so absurd I actually laughed out loud reading it. But even absurd fines, I now understood, weren't random, they were tests. Small probes to see how much a household would tolerate before pushing back. And pushing back, in Diane's world, apparently marked you as a problem resident. The HOA's annual board meeting was scheduled for the 3rd week of August, open to all residents, and Terrence suggested it as the natural moment to formally raise a pattern of discrimination complaint, backed by documentation rather than accusation. I spent the next month preparing like it was a court case, because in every way that mattered, it was organizing timelines, printing transcripts, rehearsing exactly how to present facts without letting 15 years of accumulated anger spill over into the delivery. Denise, meanwhile, quietly informed a local news producer she'd met through a parenting group about the story. Not to leak anything yet, but to have a contact ready in case Diane tried to bury the meeting in procedure. My father, back in Charlotte, asked to be looped in on everything, and when I read him the character of the neighborhood email over the phone, he went silent for a long moment before saying, "Some things don't change fast enough." I told him I was scared the board meeting would go nowhere, that Diane had run this HOA for a decade and the other board members seemed to defer to her on everything, more out of habit than agreement. For a few weeks in late July, things went unusually quiet. No new violation notices arrived. Diane's forum posts turned generic, reminders about trash day, a note about the pool schedule, nothing pointed, nothing personal. I wanted to believe she'd backed off out of some late attack of conscience. But Terrence warned me that quiet, in cases like this, usually means the other side is regrouping, not surrendering. Andre started summer basketball camp 2 towns over, and for a few weeks our lives felt almost normal again. Pickup games, ice cream after practice, Denise's mother visiting for a week. The kind of ordinary I hadn't realized I'd missed. I used the lull to finish the last of my document requests, finally receiving 3 years of partial HOA financial records after threatening, through Terrence, Formal legal action for the association's failure to comply with its own bylaws. Buried in a spreadsheet of landscaping and common area improvements was a $14,000 line item labeled Clubhouse Kitchen Upgrade. Approved. Oddly, the same month Diane had posted photos of her own newly remodeled kitchen on the neighborhood forum. I flagged it, but didn't yet understand its significance. I assumed at worst it was sloppy bookkeeping, not realizing I just found the loose thread that would eventually unravel far more than a single birthday party incident. Petrosky, during one of our now regular porch conversations, mentioned offhand that the HOA clubhouse hadn't had any actual renovation work done in at least 2 years, as far as he could tell from the padlocked, rarely used building. That single comment sent a small, cold spark through me. If no renovation happened, where had $14,000 in HOA dues actually gone? And why would Diane's personal kitchen suddenly look brand new the same month? I mentioned this to Terrence, who immediately became more interested in the finances than in the racial pattern alone, explaining that HOA fund misappropriation, if provable, could remove Diane far faster and far more completely than a discrimination complaint alone. Discrimination cases are slow and often settle quietly, he said. Financial fraud against a homeowners association, if it's real, moves fast, because boards protect money faster than they protect their own residents. I began requesting invoices for every line item over $500 in the last 2 fiscal years. A request Diane, cornered by her own bylaws again, could not legally refuse without triggering an automatic review by the HOA's outside management company. The stall tactics returned immediately, more aggressive this time, a claim that the invoices were with the accountant, then that the accountant was on medical leave. Excuses stacking up like a dam that both of us knew was starting to crack. Denise's news contact, a local reporter named Priya Shah, called to check in, careful not to push, just letting us know she was still interested whenever there's something concrete, a patience I appreciated more than she probably realized. My father flew back up for Labor Day weekend. Smaller and quieter this trip somehow, though his eyes lit up the moment Andre ran to hug him at the airport gate. Birthday party fully forgotten in his grandson's excitement. Watching them together, I felt the full weight of what I was building toward, not revenge exactly, but something closer to a debt finally being tallied. A ledger that had been one-sided for far too long. The calm broke in mid-September, and it broke hard. Diane called an emergency board session, unannounced to most residents, where she proposed a new rule requiring pre-approval for any gathering exceeding 10 guests, down from the previous limit of 15. I only learned about the meeting because Petrosky, now fully in our corner, texted me a photo of the flyer posted at the clubhouse door, dated for 2 days later, clearly timed to slip through before wider objection could form. I showed up anyway, uninvited but not turned away, and sat in the back row while Diane presented the rule as simple, neutral, for everyone's safety, never once mentioning the party that had obviously inspired it. One board member, a soft-spoken man named Gary, asked mildly why the limit was dropping now, after a decade unchanged. Diane's answer was smooth. We've just had some concerning gatherings lately that made residents uneasy. I raised my hand. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, whether concerning gatherings referred to my father's 70th birthday party, the one where police had been called for a non-existent gun that never existed. The room went very still. Diane's smile flickered but didn't fully drop. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," she said. "But if the rule doesn't affect you, there's no reason to take it personally." "It affects my family specifically," I said, "and I have the 911 transcript to show exactly how." I hadn't planned to reveal it that night, but her denial pulled it out of me before I could stop myself. Gasps rippled through a room of maybe 30 neighbors. Diane recovered fast, insisting the call must have come from someone else. A claim immediately undercut by the fact that only she knew, before I said it, that a call had happened at all. The meeting ended in chaos, procedurally tabled without a vote. But something had shifted permanently in that room. 30 neighbors now knew a name, a transcript, and a question that wouldn't quietly disappear again. Diane cornered me in the parking lot afterward, dropping the maternal tone entirely for the first time. "You have no idea what you're starting," she said, low and tight. "This neighborhood has rules for a reason. So do 911 dispatchers," I said, and walked to my car before she could answer, my hands shaking with an adrenaline I hadn't felt since the police cars first turned onto our street. Within 48 hours, a fine arrived at our house, not for anything at the party, but for improper storage of recycling containers. A $75 fine so flimsy, it read less like enforcement and more like retaliation with a paper trail. Denise wanted to fight it publicly right away. Terrence advised patience one more time. Let Diane keep generating a paper trail of retaliation, because every petty fine now was evidence of exactly the pattern we needed to prove. Priya, the reporter, called again, this time with real urgency in her voice. She'd heard secondhand about the board meeting from another resident and wanted to know if we were ready to go on record. Even partially. We weren't quite ready. Not without the financial records. But I agreed to an off-record background conversation, laying out everything, the party, the transcript, the fine pattern, the mysterious kitchen renovation that never happened at the clubhouse. Priya went quiet on the line for a moment, then said, "This isn't a neighbor dispute story anymore. This is a public accountability story," and I felt, for the first time, like the ground under this whole fight was solid. Meanwhile, Diane escalated her rulemaking campaign, pushing a second proposal requiring HOA approval for any resident speaking to media on behalf of the community. A rule so transparently aimed at silencing us that even her allies on the board hesitated. Gary, the soft-spoken board member, quietly reached out to me by email, admitting he'd voted with Diane out of habit for years and asking, carefully, whether the 911 transcript I'd mentioned was something he could actually see. I sent it to him, alongside the fine pattern spreadsheet, and 2 days later he replied with 4 words that mattered more than he probably knew. "This isn't okay, Marcus." Gary began quietly gathering his own concerns from other board members, discovering that at least 2 others had similar unease about Diane's unilateral decisions, though none had felt safe voicing it while she controlled every meeting's agenda. The invoices I'd requested for the clubhouse kitchen upgrade finally arrived, heavily redacted, missing exactly the vendor name and payment destination that would have proven anything, a redaction so aggressive it functioned as its own confession. Terrence flagged the redaction immediately as a bylaw violation itself, since HOA financial records legally couldn't be withheld from dues-paying members except in narrow, specific circumstances that clearly didn't apply here. We filed a formal demand letter, copying the HOA's management company and, Per Terrence's suggestion, the state's Community Association Regulatory Office, a move that finally applied pressure from outside Diane's total control of the room. Diane's response arrived not from her, but from a lawyer. A boilerplate letter accusing me of harassment of a volunteer board member and threatening a restraining order if I continued targeting her personally. I forwarded it to Terrence, who actually laughed, and said, "This is what it looks like when someone realizes the floor is cracking under them but doesn't know which board yet to grab." The lawyer's letter backfired in one specific way. It forced the state regulatory office, now formally copied on our earlier demand, to open a preliminary file, since threatening a resident over a public records request raised its own red flags. Word of the letter spread quickly through the neighborhood text chain, and for the first time, residents I'd never spoken to began reaching out. Not all supportive, but enough to show cracks in what had seemed like total consensus behind Diane. The Hendersons, notably, stayed silent, and I later learned it was because their own smoker, identical to mine, had somehow never once drawn a fine, a fact several neighbors now openly noticed and discussed among themselves. Diane responded to the growing whispers with a mass email titled, "Setting the Record Straight," in which she claimed the 911 call had been a good faith safety concern, and that any suggestion of race was deeply unfair and divisive. The email backfired instantly, because in trying to explain herself, she'd confirmed publicly, in writing, that she had in fact been the caller, the exact fact she had denied outright at the board meeting weeks earlier. I didn't even need to point this out. 3 separate neighbors replied, all within the hour, noting the contradiction, and the community forum, usually Diane's tightly controlled territory, erupted into a debate she could no longer moderate away. Sensing the tide turning, Diane called for an emergency vote to remove me from the HOA's optional volunteer landscaping committee, citing conduct unbecoming a committee member. A petty move that read, to almost everyone watching, as pure panic. The vote failed, 7-2. The first time in a decade anyone could remember Diane losing a procedural motion in front of the full board, and the silence in that room afterward felt like a held breath finally releasing. That same week, Petrosky's son, the young man Diane had once threatened to report as a safety concern, was accepted into a supported employment program he'd been working toward for 2 years. News Petrosky shared with tears in his eyes on our porch. "She almost took this from him," he told me, "just by making him feel like a problem instead of a person." It reminded me exactly why this fight had never really been about my father's cake at all. Priya published a short initial piece online, careful and factual, titled simply, "HOA Dispute Raises Questions After 911 Call at Birthday Party," citing public records without naming Diane directly yet, testing the water before a fuller story. The piece spread faster than any of us expected, shared across local community groups, then regional ones, then, within days, picked up by a larger news aggregator with a headline far blunter than Priya's careful original. Comments flooded in from strangers across the country, some supportive, some cruel, some simply retelling their own versions of the same story from their own neighborhoods. And I realized, uncomfortably, how familiar this pattern was everywhere. Diane, according to Gary, was reportedly furious, blaming the media and outside agitators for what she called a mischaracterization, language that felt less like an argument and more like a script from decades of similar denials. The HOA's management company, spooked by the regulatory inquiry and the public attention, sent a formal notice announcing an independent financial audit of the association's accounts. As a routine measure to reassure residents, though everyone understood exactly why now, Diane pushed back hard against the audit in a private board email that Gary, increasingly uneasy with her leadership, quietly forwarded to Terrence, revealing her arguing that some records simply don't need outside eyes. That single sentence, more than anything else, convinced the remaining neutral board members that something real was being hidden, and support for the audit passed unanimously. Diane's objection overruled for the second time in a month. Sensing her control slipping, Diane shifted tactics entirely, appearing at my door one evening alone. No lawyer, no notice, asking almost pleadingly if we could put this behind us as neighbors before things went too far. I told her the time for that conversation had been back in April, before the 911 call, and that whatever happened next was simply the natural result of choices she'd made entirely on her own. She left without another word, and I stood on my porch a long moment afterward, feeling not triumphant exactly, but something quieter, the specific relief of finally being believed by people who mattered. The audit took 3 weeks. In that time, Diane grew visibly erratic on the community forum, deleting posts, banning 2 residents for disruptive commentary, actions that only fed the growing sense that she was managing a collapse, not a controversy. My father called weekly for updates, and each time I told him something new, he'd go quiet, then say some version of the same thing. Truth's slow, son, but it's patient. It outlasts people who lie fast. Andre, watching all this unfold at an age old enough to understand most of it, told me one night he was proud of me, a sentence that hit harder than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. The audit findings arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered simultaneously to the full board and, per the regulatory office's involvement, to the State Association oversight file, meaning Diane could no longer control who saw them or when. The clubhouse kitchen upgrade line item turned out traced to a contractor with no business license, whose payment had gone not to any clubhouse work at all, but to a residential renovation permit filed under Diane Whitfield's own home address. $14,000 in HOA dues, paid by every household on Willowbrook Court including ours, had funded Diane's kitchen remodel, disguised through a shell invoice that any competent bookkeeper would have flagged years earlier. It wasn't an isolated instance either. The audit found 2 smaller landscaping line items, totaling another $6,000. That traced to a private lawn service used exclusively at Diane's own residence, never once at the actual clubhouse grounds. Gary read the audit summary aloud at the next board meeting, his voice steady but visibly shaken, and for the first time in a decade, Diane sat in that room without a single ready explanation. "I can explain the accounting," she started. And the room, quietly, without anyone organizing it, simply stopped listening, a kind of silence more damning than any argument anyone could have made against her. What happened next surprised even Terrence. Diane, cornered and clearly desperate, didn't apologize or resign. Instead, she doubled down, accusing the audit itself of being compromised by outside racial politics, designed to remove a dedicated volunteer from her rightful position. She sent a mass email to every household demanding a vote of confidence to reaffirm her presidency. framing the entire situation as an attack on the values that built this community, language several longtime residents found chillingly familiar. Two households I'd never spoken with before this. Longtime white residents who'd lived there since the subdivision's founding quietly told me they'd always felt uneasy about Diane's tone but never had language for it until now. Diane, sensing her support crumbling among the broader membership, made her most reckless move yet. She filed for an emergency HOA lien against our property, citing unpaid fines totaling $1,240 for violations I had never been formally notified of. Terrence called it, flatly, the single dumbest thing she could have done, since HOA liens require documented notice periods under state law, and no such notices existed anywhere in our mail, our email, or the HOA's own records. We filed an immediate legal challenge to the lien, and Terrence simultaneously reported the attempted filing to the same state regulatory office already investigating the financial audit, adding a new, uglier layer to Diane's mounting exposure. Word of the lien attempt spread through the neighborhood faster than anything before it. Retaliatory liens against a family whose only public offense had been surviving a false 911 call struck even Diane's remaining defenders as indefensible. Priya's follow-up story ran within days, this time naming Diane directly, backed by the audit findings, the lien filing, and a copy of the character of the neighborhood email Petrosky had kept for years out of quiet fear. The story went further than the first, picked up by 2 local television stations, both requesting comment from Diane, who declined through her attorney, a silence that read, in the court of public opinion, as its own confession. My father, watching a clip of the news segment from his living room in Charlotte, called me laughing for the first time in months. 30 years on the job, he said, and I never once needed a news crew to prove I was telling the truth. Diane's own adult daughter, Kelsey, who lived 2 states away, reportedly called Gary directly after seeing the news coverage, apologizing on behalf of the family and confirming privately that she'd worried about her mother's behavior for years. Gary, without violating any confidence, told me only that the call had happened and that it had visibly shaken him, proof that even Diane's own family recognized the pattern the rest of us had spent months documenting. Under mounting pressure from the regulatory office, the management company, and now regional media, the HOA board scheduled a special emergency session to formally vote on Diane's continued presidency. The first such vote in the association's history. Diane, in a final act of defiance, attempted to postpone the vote by claiming a scheduling conflict, a delay tactic the board, emboldened now by outside oversight, rejected outright for the first time in 10 years. In the days before the vote, someone we never confirmed who anonymously mailed every household a printed packet containing the audit summary, the character of the neighborhood email, and a timeline of every documented fine disparity. Diane accused me directly of sending it, though Terrence had specifically advised against exactly that kind of action, wary of undermining our credibility with anything that could be framed as harassment rather than accountability. I told her plainly, in front of 2 board members, that I hadn't sent it, and that, frankly, at this point, half the street likely had enough documentation to have assembled that packet entirely on their own. The night before the vote, Denise found me sitting alone on the back patio, staring at the spot where the smoker had sat during my father's party, and asked if I was scared it still wouldn't be enough. I told her the truth. I wasn't scared of losing anymore. Whatever happened at that vote, the record now existed, permanent and undeniable, in ways it hadn't before. I'd started keeping that first folder months earlier. My father drove up unannounced the morning of the vote, 7 hours from Charlotte, saying only, "A man doesn't miss the ending of something that started at his own birthday party." And I hugged him longer than I had in years. The clubhouse was packed that evening, every folding chair filled, residents standing along the walls, a turnout no one could remember happening for any HOA meeting in the neighborhood's entire 22-year history. Diane arrived last, composed, dressed sharply, carrying a folder of her own. And for a moment I almost admired the sheer discipline of a woman about to fight for control of a beige, hedge-lined kingdom with everything she had left. Gary opened the meeting, reading the audit findings aloud again for residents who hadn't yet seen them, his voice steadier this time, carried by the visible support of a room that had clearly already made up its mind. Diane requested time to respond, and the board granted it, a fairness she had rarely extended to anyone else in 10 years of running these meetings exactly the way she wanted them run. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, framing herself as a devoted volunteer under attack. The kitchen expenses as an accounting oversight, the lien as a clerical error, the 911 call as an honest, if imperfect, safety concern. Then Kelsey, her own daughter, stood up from the third row, where no one had realized she was sitting, and asked to speak, a request that visibly staggered Diane more than anything the board or I had said all night. Kelsey spoke carefully but plainly, describing years of watching her mother treat certain neighbors differently, describing overhearing the exact phrase "character of the neighborhood," used casually at family dinners long before any email made it public. "I love my mother," Kelsey said, voice shaking but clear. "But I can't sit here and let people believe this was ever about safety. It wasn't. Time, and I should have said something sooner." The room was utterly silent. Diane, for the first time in this entire saga, said nothing at all, her carefully composed expression finally cracking into something that looked unmistakably like genuine shock. The board called for the vote of confidence immediately after, conducted by secret ballot to protect residents still uneasy about retaliation. A precaution that, given everything documented, no one in that room questioned. Counting took 11 minutes that felt considerably longer. Gary read the final tally aloud. 41 votes against Diane retaining the presidency. 6 in favor. 3 abstentions. A landslide that ended a decade of unchecked control in a single evening. Diane stood, gathered her folder, and walked out without a word, past neighbors who, months earlier, would never have imagined this room capable of turning against her so completely and so fast. What followed wasn't relief exactly. Not yet. The lien challenge was still pending. The financial fraud findings still needed formal referral to the state. And Diane, even removed from the presidency, remained a resident, a neighbor, a fact none of us could simply erase. Terrence filed the formal fraud referral the following Monday, using the audit as its foundation. And within 2 weeks, the state's Community Association office confirmed it was opening a full investigation into the misappropriated funds. The lien against our property was voided entirely, the judge in the small claims hearing calling it, in Terrence's words, about as textbook an example of retaliatory filing as I've seen. Language that made the local paper's brief write-up of the hearing. Diane, No longer HOA president. Still occasionally appeared at community events. Quieter now. Avoided rather than confronted. A kind of social erosion that felt, to me, more honest than any single punishment could have been. Gary was elected the HOA's new president in a follow-up vote. Running on a simple platform, transparent finances, equal enforcement, and an independent review of every outstanding fine issued in the past 3 years. Under Gary's review, over 60 households, mine included, had wrongful fines formally reversed and refunded, a modest sum individually but, taken together, a small, tangible acknowledgement of a pattern finally named out loud and corrected. The Okafor's basketball hoop fine was reversed. Petrosky's son's safety concern file was permanently expunged from HOA records at Gary's personal insistence. Small things, but the kind of small things that had never once gone our way before. Priya's story, by then picked up nationally, prompted messages from residents in at least 4 other states describing eerily similar HOA patterns, several of whom credited our documentation approach as the reason they finally felt able to speak up themselves. My father, back in Charlotte, told me on the phone that he'd started getting calls from old firehouse friends who'd seen the story, several of them saying some version of, "That's exactly why we kept our own files too, all those years." I asked him if it bothered him, being at the center of a story he hadn't asked to be part of. He laughed, low and warm. "Son, I spent 30 years running into burning buildings. A birthday party barely counts." Andre, for his part, wrote a short essay about the whole ordeal for a school assignment on a time your family stood up for something. And reading it, seeing how carefully he'd understood every part of it, undid me more than the audit had. The state's fraud investigation concluded 4 months later, finding Diane personally liable for the misappropriated $20,000. Ordering full restitution to the HOA and a formal censure barring her from serving on any community association board for 10 years. She paid the restitution, according to Gary, in full and without further public objection. A quiet ending to a decade of loud control. The kind of anticlimax that somehow felt more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have. I want to be honest about something. Even after all of this, I didn't feel the pure, uncomplicated triumph I'd expected months earlier, sitting in that backyard watching police cars roll away from my father's ruined birthday cake. What I felt instead was tired, and grateful, and a little sad that it had taken a public investigation, a news story, and a daughter's testimony against her own mother to get something as basic as equal treatment on our own street. Denise reminded me, gently, that tired and grateful were allowed to sit together, that not every ending needed to feel like a movie, that sometimes justice simply looked like paperwork finally catching up to the truth. We planned my father's 71st birthday for that August. A full year almost to the day since the first party. And this time I found myself hesitant, half expecting some new complication to appear out of nowhere. Gary, now HOA president, personally stopped by 2 weeks before the party, not to inspect anything, but to ask if the association could help, offering, on his own initiative, to cover the cost of extra folding chairs from the community fund. I told him that wasn't necessary, that we'd manage fine on our own like always, and he said, quietly, "I know you'd manage. I just want it on record that this HOA supports this family." Let me do this. Word of the second party spread differently than the first had, not through a false 911 call, but through an actual, genuine community group chat, neighbors asking what they could bring, whether Andre's basketball hoop could handle extra kids. The Hendersons, silent for so long during the ordeal, showed up that day too, a little sheepish, bringing a cooler of drinks and an apology I hadn't asked for but appreciated more than I expected to. Petrosky arrived early, as he always did now, helping set up folding tables without being asked. His son beside him, both of them laughing at something on the drive over that I never did find out. The Okafors brought jollof rice and their own smoker, setting it up right beside ours. A small, deliberate act of solidarity that needed no explanation to anyone standing in that backyard that afternoon. At 4:15, the exact time, a year earlier, a squad car had turned onto our street. Andre glanced nervously toward the road out of pure old instinct, and I saw him relax, physically relax. When nothing came, my father noticed too, older, and said, loud enough for a few of us to hear, "See that, buddy?" Sometimes the second chapter writes itself different than the first. I hadn't planned for what happened next, and I still don't fully know who arranged it, but around 5 o'clock, a fire truck, lights off, no sirens, rolled slowly onto Willowbrook Court and parked outside our house. My stomach dropped instinctively, old fear rising fast, until I saw who stepped out first. A fire captain in full dress uniform, holding a large sheet cake, followed by 4 firefighters, all smiling, none of them in any hurry at all. "Captain James Coleman," the fire captain called out. Walking up our driveway, "We heard it was your 71st, and given everything this street's been through, the department thought you deserved a proper escort this time." My father stood frozen for a moment, the same firehouse composure I'd watched hold steady through everything finally cracking, just slightly, at the corners of his eyes. It turned out one of the firefighters at last year's original false alarm call had recognized my father's old department cap and rank insignia, quietly looked up his service record afterward, and never forgotten the retired captain who'd stood so calmly in his own backyard. When that firefighter heard, through Priya's news coverage, about this year's second birthday, he'd arranged with his captain, off duty, no call required, to personally deliver a cake and a small plaque honoring 30 years of fire service. The plaque read simply, "To Captain James Coleman, 30 years of running toward danger for strangers. This department is proud to call you one of our own. Then and now." My father held that plaque a long moment, then handed it carefully to Andre, saying, "Keep this somewhere safe, buddy. Some days the world gets it wrong. Today it got it right." The backyard, 20-some neighbors, 2 firefighters who stayed to eat, and my father at the center of it all, felt, for the first time since any of this started, like exactly what it had always been meant to be, a celebration, uncomplicated by fear. Diane wasn't there, of course, hadn't been invited, though I heard secondhand from Petrosky that she'd stayed inside her house that whole afternoon with the blinds drawn, the sound of our music and laughter carrying easily across 2 fences. I won't pretend I felt nothing about that. There was a small, human part of me that wanted her to see it, to understand exactly what she tried and failed to take from us. But mostly, By then, I simply didn't think about her much at all. Terrence called that evening to check in, laughing when I described the fire truck's unexpected arrival. "That's the kind of ending you can't manufacture," he said. "That one, the universe just handed you." Priya asked, gently, if she could write a short follow-up piece about the second birthday. The fire department's gesture, the community's shift a year later. I said yes, on one condition, that the story center my father, not the conflict. Her follow-up ran with a simple headline, quieter than the first. 1 year later, a different kind of knock at the door, and it spread almost as widely, for entirely better reasons this time. Andre, now 13, told a reporter who called our house that week that he wanted to be a firefighter like his grandfather someday. A sentence that made my father, for the second time that summer, need a moment before he could answer. Gary, now well into his first year as HOA president, implemented a permanent equal enforcement review board, staffed by rotating volunteer residents, rather than a single fixed authority, specifically designed so no future president could quietly accumulate the kind of unchecked power Diane once held. The clubhouse, symbolically, finally got its real kitchen renovation that fall, funded transparently, itemized publicly on the community forum, used for its first genuine community potluck in over 2 years. I was asked, somewhat to my surprise, to help design the new HOA's transparency policy, drawing directly from the documentation habits I developed almost by accident during the worst months of that year. Denise joked that I'd accidentally become the neighborhood's unofficial records keeper, a title I wore with more pride than I expected, considering it had started as nothing more than a folder I never thought I'd actually need. My father stayed an extra week that year before flying home, spending most mornings on our back patio with coffee, watching Andre practice free throws, saying less than usual, seeming, in his own quiet way, entirely at peace. Before he left, he told me something I've held on to since. "You didn't fight that woman to win, son. You fought her so the next family on the street wouldn't have to fight the same fight from zero." That October, the state regulatory office's final report on Diane's misconduct became public record, and Priya, with our blessing, published a comprehensive piece tying the entire timeline together, from the false 911 call to the final restitution order. The piece detailed how Diane had personally placed the call, how the kitchen upgrade invoice traced directly to her own home renovation permit, and how she'd attempted a retaliatory lien against our property using fabricated fine notices. It also detailed, for the first time publicly, that Diane's presidency itself had technically been improperly reaffirmed 3 years earlier, when a board quorum requirement wasn't actually met, a procedural flaw only discovered during Gary's later review of old meeting minutes. That detail meant Diane had, in a strict legal sense, been operating without a fully valid mandate for the majority of the fines, rules, and enforcement actions issued against families like mine and the Okafors during that period. Terrence explained that while this wouldn't retroactively undo years of fines, it strengthened our broader civil complaint significantly, since it demonstrated Diane hadn't just abused legitimate authority, but had in part manufactured the appearance of authority she never fully possessed. Diane's attorney, in a brief public statement, called the procedural finding a technicality, a phrase that, by this point in the story, had come to feel like her default response to every single piece of evidence against her. Kelsey, Diane's daughter, gave one final interview to a regional outlet, saying only that she hoped her mother would eventually find some peace with the truth. A sentence that struck me as remarkably generous given everything. I thought often, during that fall, about how differently this could have ended if Petrosky had stayed silent. If Gary had never forwarded that one damning email. If Kelsey had chosen loyalty over honesty at that final vote. Terrence told me once that most cases like this die quietly, buried under fear, deniability, and the simple exhaustion of fighting someone who controls the very process meant to hold them accountable. And he was right. Ours had nearly died the same way. Twice. What saved it, I came to believe, wasn't any single dramatic confrontation, but the slow, unglamorous accumulation of documented truth, folder by folder, email by email, until denial simply became mathematically impossible to sustain. Our civil complaint against Diane, filed jointly with the Okafors and Petrosky, settled out of court that November. The terms confidential except for one public component. A formal, written apology read aloud at an HOA meeting, witnessed by Gary and the full board. Diane didn't attend to read it herself. Her attorney read it on her behalf. A small, telling detail that somehow said more about her than any words in the letter itself could have. The letter acknowledged, in careful legal language, that the 911 call had been made in error, without adequate justification, and that fine enforcement patterns may have disproportionately affected certain households. Phrasing so cautious it barely resembled an apology at all. I didn't need it to feel like a real apology by then. The audit, the vote, the fraud finding, the voided lien, and the fire department showing up with a cake had already told me everything a formal letter never could. Denise framed a printout of the final regulatory report and hung it, half joking, half serious, in our home office, calling it the ugliest, most necessary piece of paperwork this family will ever own. Andre asked, that winter, if Diane still lived on our street. I told him yes, that she did, that not every ending in real life comes with someone moving away in disgrace, and that sometimes justice looks like accountability without exile. He thought about that for a while, then said something that surprised me with its clarity. I guess it's better that she has to stay and see everything got fixed anyway. I didn't have anything to add to that. By the following spring, the HOA under Gary's leadership had grown almost unrecognizable from what it had been. Open financial reports, rotating volunteer oversight, an actual equal enforcement review board that had already reversed a dozen more questionable fines from years past. The Willowbrook Court Forum, once Diane's tightly moderated domain, became something closer to an actual community space. Potluck planning, lost cat notices, genuine neighborly small talk instead of ruler measurements and certified violation letters. My father's birthday, now something of a minor neighborhood tradition, drew a bigger crowd each year, and by his 73rd, half the street showed up unprompted, treating it less like our family's private party and more like a shared community occasion. The fire department's gesture, turned out, hadn't been a one-time thing either. The same captain returned the following year too, this time simply to eat ribs and swap stories with my father. No cake required, just genuine friendship formed from an unlikely beginning. I still keep the folder, the original one, the one Denise used to tease me about, tucked in a drawer in our home office, not out of lingering anger, but as a reminder of exactly what patient, careful documentation can accomplish. Petrosky's son eventually became something of a fixture at these gatherings too, comfortable in a way I hadn't seen in him during those earlier, fearful years, laughing easily with Andre and his friends over the grill. Amara Okafor told me once, at one of these later cookouts, that she credited our public records request, the very first one I'd filed almost on instinct, as the moment that gave her and her family the courage to finally speak up themselves. I hadn't thought of that folder as courage at the time. It had felt, mostly, like fear translated into paperwork. A way of protecting myself and my family in the only language I trusted to hold up against denial. Looking back, though, I understood Amara was right. Courage doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks exactly like a stack of printed emails, a spreadsheet of fines, and the stubborn refusal to let a lie stand simply because it's easier than the truth. Diane, for her part, kept largely to herself in the years that followed, occasionally waving politely from her driveway, a small, awkward gesture that Denise once described as the wave of someone who knows the whole street remembers exactly what happened. I never sought her out for any final confrontation, and I never needed one. The audit had said what needed saying. The vote had said the rest. Whatever quiet reckoning happened inside her own house, I decided, wasn't mine to witness or demand. Terrence, wrapping up the last of the settlement paperwork that spring, told me our case had quietly become something of a reference point for 2 other HOA disputes he was now consulting on in neighboring counties. Families using our documentation method as a template. That felt, in its own way, like the truest ending to all of it. Not just accountability for one HOA on one street, but a small, replicable proof that patient, careful evidence could move even the most entrenched, self-protected authority. My father, now 73, still calls every few months just to check in, and every single time, without fail, he asks the same joking question. Any Karens on your street lately? Or is it my turn to worry about something else? I always tell him the same thing. And it's always still true. The street's quieter now. Not because everyone agrees on everything, but because for the first time since we moved in, quiet doesn't feel like something being enforced by fear. Andre, now a freshman in high school, still keeps that fire department plaque on a shelf in his room. And last spring he wrote a college application essay about it. About documentation. About patience. About what accountability actually requires from ordinary people. Denise reminds me sometimes that we never set out to become the family whose HOA dispute made regional news. That we just wanted a birthday party. Ribs on the smoker. String lights. 20 guests. Nothing more complicated than that. But complicated found us anyway. The way it finds a lot of families who simply want an ordinary afternoon in their own backyard. And I've made peace with the fact that our ordinary afternoon became something else entirely. What I hold on to now, more than the audit findings or the voided lien or even the fire truck rolling quietly onto our street, is the image of my father, plaque in hand, telling Andre that some days the world gets it right. It didn't get it right on its own. Took a folder, a paralegal cousin, a scared but decent board member, a daughter willing to contradict her own mother, and a lot of very patient, Very tired people simply refusing to let a lie outlast the truth. I think about Diane sometimes, not with hatred anymore, just a kind of tired clarity. The understanding that people who build their comfort on other people's fear eventually meet a version of accountability, even if it arrives slower and quieter than anyone watching would like. The HOA still exists, still collects dues, still enforces rules. But under Gary it enforces them the same way for everyone. Mailbox colors and grass height and smoker placement measured by the same ruler for every single house on the street. That, more than any single dramatic vote or news headline, feels like the real victory, not that Diane lost. Exactly. But that the ordinary machinery of the neighborhood finally started running fair, quiet, and mostly unremarkable, the way it always should have. My father's 74th birthday is coming up this summer, and Andres already asked if the fire captain might come by again. Half joking, half hopeful, and I told him I honestly don't know. That some things you can't plan twice. But whether the fire truck comes or not, I know exactly what will happen in that backyard this year. Ribs on the smoker. Neighbors we actually trust now. A father who spent 30 years running toward danger finally getting to simply sit still and be celebrated. And if anyone ever asks me what changed on Willowbrook Court, I tell them the truth. Nothing changed until enough of us stopped being quiet about what we'd been documenting all along. Diane Whitfield taught me, without ever meaning to, that authority without accountability curdles into something ugly no matter how polite its voice sounds, and that the antidote isn't anger. Though anger has its place, the antidote is patience, evidence, and neighbors willing to finally speak. My father's plaque still sits on Andre's shelf, dust-free, clearly cared for, and every time I see it I think less about the false 911 call that started all of this, and more about the fire captain who chose, on his own time, to make it right. That choice, small as it was, one man and one cake and one afternoon, mattered more to my family than any board vote or audit finding, because it was the first proof, before any of the rest came, that we hadn't imagined the injustice, and we weren't alone in wanting it corrected. Looking at this whole year now from a distance, I can trace every twist back to a simple root. One woman's need for control collided with one family's insistence on being treated fairly. And the truth, given enough patient documentation, eventually won. I don't know if Diane ever truly understood what she lost. Not just a title, not just $20,000 in restitution, but the quiet, unearned deference an entire street had extended her for a decade without ever really questioning why. Gary told me once, near the end of his first year as president, that the hardest part of the whole transition wasn't fixing the finances or the fines, but rebuilding residents' basic trust that speaking up wouldn't cost them anything. I think that trust is the real, lasting inheritance of everything that happened, more than the refunded fines or the voided lien or even the fire truck. A street where families no longer have to keep a folder just to feel safe. Still, keep mine. Old habits, especially ones born from fear, don't disappear just because the danger has passed. And some quiet part of me suspects I'll keep that folder, updated and ready, for as long as we live on this street. Denise says that's fine, that some tools are worth keeping even after the job that first required them is done. The same way my father still keeps his old department radio in a drawer, decades after his last shift ended. Andre asked me recently if I was still angry at Diane. I told him honestly that I wasn't. Not anymore. That anger had done its job early on, driving me to document everything, but that holding it forever would only cost me, not her. What I feel now, mostly, is something closer to vigilance, a quiet readiness to notice patterns early, to keep records without waiting for a crisis, to believe my own family's experience even when someone in authority insists we're imagining it. That vigilance, more than any single victory, feels like the truest gift my father's ruined, then redeemed, birthday ultimately gave us, not bitterness, but a kind of clear-eyed readiness that I hope, eventually, I won't have to use again. The last time I saw Diane up close was at a community cleanup day that spring. Both of us reaching for the same trash bag dispenser at the same moment. An awkward, almost comic collision after everything we'd been through. Neither of us said much. I nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't warmth, but it was, at least, two neighbors sharing the same ordinary Saturday task without fear on either side, which felt, honestly, like enough. I still think, sometimes, about the exact moment those squad car lights first hit our fence line. My father's hands going still over the smoker. My son's face draining of color. And I let myself feel it fully instead of pushing it away. Because pretending it didn't happen, or that it didn't matter, was never going to protect Andre from a world that still, in plenty of other places, hasn't learned the lesson our street eventually did. What I want him to remember instead, when he's grown with kids of his own, isn't the fear from that first birthday, but the fire truck rolling quietly onto our street a year later. Cake in hand. Proof that things can be made right. My father, asked once by a local reporter what he wanted people to take from the whole story, said something simple that I've since had printed on a small card I keep in my wallet. Document the wrong. Then live loud enough to prove it was worth documenting. I've tried to live by that since, not loud in the sense of anger, but loud in the sense of visibility, of refusing to let quiet, polite injustice go unnoticed simply because confronting it feels impolite. The Okafors, the Petroskis, the Barlows, even the once silent Hendersons, all of us occupy the same street now in a way that feels different than before. Not perfect, not without its own small frictions, but honest in a way it wasn't for years. Gary's still president, running unopposed each year since, not because no one else wants the job, but because, as Petrosky put it once, nobody's in a hurry to fix what isn't broken anymore. I think about Kelsey sometimes too, Diane's daughter, wondering what those family dinners look like now. Wondering if the courage it took her to stand up at that final vote cost her something at home I'll never fully know about. Terrence tells me our case still comes up in his work. Cited now, informally, among a small network of attorneys handling similar HOA disputes. A strange kind of legacy for a birthday party that was only ever supposed to be about ribs and cake. My father's 74th birthday arrived that August much like the others now. Folding tables, string lights, the Okafor's smoker beside ours. Andre manning the speaker. Careful, this time out of habit rather than fear, to keep the volume reasonable after 8. No squad car came, though Andre kept glancing hopefully at the street until well past 5. My father just laughed, pulling him close. Some years the story's simple. Buddy. Simple's good too. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone, my father and I sat alone by the smoker's dying coals, the way we used to before any of this happened, and he asked me, quietly, if I was proud of how it all turned out. I told him the truth. I was proud, but tired in a way that never fully leaves. The specific tired of someone who had to fight simply to be treated the way his neighbors were treated automatically. Without question. Without a folder required. He nodded, understanding completely, having carried that exact tiredness himself for 30 years in a firehouse that hadn't always made room for him either, and said only, "That tired doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It means you did something hard." We sat there a while longer, coals fading, Andre's laughter drifting from inside the house, Denise's voice calling him in for the night, and I felt, for the first time in over a year, entirely, uncomplicatedly at peace on that patio. Willowbrook Court, these days, still looks much the same from the street. Beige houses, clipped hedges, matching mailboxes, but underneath that sameness now sits something that wasn't there before. A documented, hard-won insistence that fairness apply to everyone, equally, without exception. Diane still lives 2 doors down from the Petroskis. Quiet now, mostly unseen. A woman who once held total control over an entire street's sense of safety and belonging, and lost it, in the end, not to revenge, but to the plain, patient weight of the truth. I don't know what she thinks about. Alone in that house she funded partly with our dues. But I know what I think about: a fire truck, a cake, a plaque on my son's shelf, and a father who finally, fully, got to have his birthday. My father blew out 74 candles that night under string lights and a sky full of ordinary stars, surrounded by neighbors who'd finally learned to see him clearly, and for the first time since that first ruined cake. Nothing about the evening felt like it needed defending. The END.